Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and welcome to CAIR Michigan's sixth session of the History of Racism and Resistance in America. My name is Zainab Rahas. I'm the Director of Safe Spaces at CAIR Michigan, and I'm delighted to present to you all today's discussion and welcome Attorney Haaris Ahmad, who is also CAIR Michigan's Board President. Assalamu alaikum, brother. How are you?
Wa alaikum salam. How are you doing, Zainab?
Alhamdulillah, good to have you on today. So for those of you who are just watching for the first time, this is a class series that we have every Thursday. This is our sixth session. Brother Haaris will be discussing the history of policing in America. If you've missed previous sessions, we keep them all on our YouTube and Facebook pages, so be sure to go back and watch previous sessions that we've hosted. And if you're watching today live, please, we welcome you all to share this link so that your friends and family can learn and watch along with you. If you have questions while you're watching, feel free to comment in the comment section under YouTube or Facebook, and we'll be sure to address those after the presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Brother Haaris and get started.
All right, thank you so much. Jazakumullah khair. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. As-salatu was-salamu ala rasulih al-kareem. It's great to have everybody here, whether you're live or you're watching this now after the fact. With this important series that we have, it's something that, is CAIR Michigan's commitment to increase our educational component, to increase a focus on reaching out to our community and enhancing awareness of a variety of important issues. And of course, in light of current events, this is very relevant as to this series. And inshallah, we'll continue to build upon this and enhance it. The topic for today, I know that you've covered a variety of different topics before if you've been watching the series. I think last time it was on slave codes with Sister Amy, our staff attorney. Of course, we'll tie into the subject we're going to talk about today, which is the history of policing. I want to say up front that I am not a historian and I am not a criminologist. I am an attorney. I have studied the law. I've also practiced in the area of civil rights law, have touched upon some of the key topics, but I am not a historian and I'm not a criminologist. So please understand that when we are going through this, and there will be lots of areas I think to explore further, and I would encourage you to do so. This is just simply a survey from my research and in the time that we have. So with that, I want to get started, and I'll share my screen, share my presentation. So just give me 1 second. Okay. And okay, 1 second. I apologize. I have to applications. I want to make sure I share the right thing with you. Okay. Now that we've got the technical difficulties out of the way, so you should be seeing my screen, and we will focus on that. All right, there we go. And then I will go to the actual presentation, and that way we can talk from there. So the history of policing in America. This is a broad topic. It's a very big topic, and of course, it's a hot button topic. It's one that we are, going through at the moment, and we are trying to grapple with it, and we may not be familiar with it. I think there's a lot of things that we may not be familiar with, and we'll be surprised. As with anything, you want to look at the definition of what you're covering, and policing has a lot of broad definitions. Some were just loose definitions of informal community policing. But then what we are going to be talking about is really talking about the formal institution of police, and it's really a relatively modern development. Before the development of the modern day police institution, this function was really handled by the military arm of a governmental entity. And that's what we're talking about, is we're talking about an institutionalized police department or police. And we start with the English. We start with the English model because it's very relevant to us in the United States. The English model was the Frank Pledge system, and the Frank Pledge system consisted of groups of 10 men, that were known as tithings, and these were really, their main function was to catch criminals and bring them to court. And these were really, it was either volunteer, they were really volunteer, and they were just pledging their time to do this for the community. And these tithings were then organized into what are called shires, which were groups of hundreds of these tithings. And an interesting thing that I came across is, so shire reeves were in charge of the shire, and that's where we get the word sheriff. So that is the origin of that. So it started out as a fairly informal system that was trying to get a little bit more organized and formal. This is, again, in England. And then along comes Sir Robert Peel. Robert Peel at the time, I think later he becomes Sir Robert Peel, and the London Metropolitan Police. And this is in 1829. And so he's considered by many to be the father of modern policing. And at this time in 1829, we're in the industrial revolution in London, obviously major city of the world. And so this was a response to industrialization and urbanization. And it really was geared towards, if we look at it now, we can look at it in retrospect, and it was geared towards class control in terms of making sure that the labor class was under control, that riots did not break out, that disorder did not break out. And this is a theme that we'll see throughout, is a control over a certain class and the use of this institution of the police. London police, Robert Peel really had an impact, obviously, on the English form of police, but he also had an impact later on. But his London police are still called bobbies. For those who are familiar and have been to London or been to the UK, United Kingdom, you'll see that they're oftentimes called bobbies, and that's after Robert Peel. So it's a nice, interesting fact as well. Bob, of course, being a nickname for Robert. So bobbies. Now, key principles that he espoused, Robert Peel, were crime prevention versus detection. Ironic, coming out of the UK and out of England, not the UK at that time, out of England, the home of Sherlock Holmes. But as opposed to that, the London Metropolitan Police was very focused on crime prevention rather than detection. And that meant, going out and trying to prevent these crimes from happening in the first place. The theory that he really espoused was beats, quote unquote beats. You hear about cops, police having beats. This came out of there. That's what they called them, preventive patrols. So, he had officers in uniform going around on patrols in different regions, and that was their beat. Now, the other innovation or the principle that he had was that this force needed to be under governmental control. Now, that seems obvious to us at this time, but these other institutions were not, or up to now, the function of the quote-unquote police or policing was performed by community members, and it was not a formal governmental controlled institution. So that was another principle. Another thing they brought was military-like organization, and this is going to be important as we look at the history as it develops in America. But bringing that organization from the military, which had a very structured regime, bringing it into the police institution. So towards that end, you had uniforms, badges with numbers on them, actually, so that each police officer was identifiable by a citizen, that this is officer number with badge number 002. Training, which again seems obvious, but was not a component up to then for the police. So he believed in training and having training for the police. And importantly and significantly, he, on the question of firearms, did not believe that the police should have firearms. He did believe that there should be some form weapon available, like batons and things like that, but that was not a major function. That was not a major part of his philosophy. So that was the English model. That was Sir Robert Peel, the Peelian model, it's even called. And this is something that was looked to by the colonial, by the colonists, actually, colonial America. Sorry, not not the colonists. I'm sorry, by the Americans. So the first official police force, and there's a debate as to which one it is, but it's believed that the first official police force was started in Boston in 1838. Now, what's interesting here is that this was formerly a private police force working for shipping merchants. So it was working for corporations. They protected the goods as they came in, Boston obviously being a major port. And interestingly enough, the merchants, they pushed politically, and they were able to shift the private cost of this force to the public under the premise of, quote unquote, the public good. And so now, it still performed the same function primarily, but it was sold to the public or to the taxpayers as a public good that they would protect all. But as you can imagine, I mean, if this is the same force, and it was the same force, and that then became public, it effectively carried forth its same mission. And this is going to be an important theme for us to look at as well, is the purpose of the force, and it really does make a difference as it carries through. The culture carries through, and it has different effects. So again, I mean, it became a force that was used for controlling the labor class and the lower classes, and protected the merchant class. So the other forces, they came around major metropolitan areas: New York City, 1845; St. Louis, 1846; Chicago, 1854; LA, 1869. And there were three distinct qualities that distinguished them from the English system that we talked about. In this case, in the American context, there was limited police authority that was defined by the law. And so that was whatever the law said is what the police were allowed to do. Now we'll talk about the effect of laws and the importance of laws later, because it is actually very significant. He who makes the laws has the power. Justice, as Thrasymachus, the philosopher that is mentioned in the Republic, Plato's Republic, talks about justice is those who control the law. Justice is from the powerful and those who control the law. And so it's very important. But limited police authority was, defined by the law. Local control. So it was not coming from the federal government, or it was very localized. And so not even the state government often, it was actually the cities and towns had local control over the police, which also led to fragmented law enforcement authority, because not only would have perhaps you'd have your town police, but then you would also have your county sheriff, and then you would have a state body as well. So there was a little bit of a fragmented law enforcement authority. There was some overlap without necessarily coordination all the time. Issues of the time, at the time, there were questions as to whether, in the American context and adopting the English system, whether they should be uniformed or not. You would think, why not? Why wouldn't have a problem with it? But at that time, in the American context, the police officers or the potential police officers felt they would be mocked. And so they didn't want to be uniformed because they just felt that it would be a means for mockery. Armed or not, again, American police officers or prospective police officers felt that the American context was inherently more violent than the English context. And so they argued in favor of being armed. And that is really what won out. And it still carries forth today, that decision. And the extent of physical force in general. Again, as opposed to the Peelian principle of really not in favor of physical force, this was actually not the way that the American police force evolved or even started. And the question of using force and using lethal force was resolved in the favor of being able to use lethal force. So, and that will affect us much later. This is primarily in the North that we're talking about. And in the North, the focus was on labor and class control, as we talked about. Now, as opposed to the North, we go to the South. And this is very important to look at, because the South, of course, had a completely different economic system and a completely different layout. And of course, it was built off of slave labor. The wealth of the South was dependent on slave labor, whereas the wealth of the North was dependent on cheap labor, but maybe indentured servitude, but also cheap labor. But the South was built off of slave labor, as we know. And so the purpose of the policing in the South in the beginning was the preservation of the slave system. This is obviously extremely important for us to understand, because a lot of what develops carries forth in history. So the first slave patrol was in Carolina. At that time, it was Carolina, the Carolina colony. It was not North or South, which obviously is split into later. First slave patrol. They were called slave patrols, and that was in 1704. There were other colonies that also had slave patrols, and so this was aimed at slaves, but it was also used, interestingly enough, later on against white indentured servants, showing that oftentimes this was a class thing as well as a racial thing, and an economic issue. So the main duties of these slave patrols was to search for slave lodges. So of course, keeping slaves as they perhaps were trying to escape. Keeping slaves off roadways, again, part of preventing slave escapes. Disrupting slave meetings. They didn't want them to be organizing slave revolts or rebellions. And of course, these are that was the main primary driving reason. So in 1837, Charleston's police department had 100 officers, and the primary function was slave patrol. So 100 officers, and you can imagine, I didn't get the population of Charleston at the time in 1837, but it could not have been very large. So 100 officers is quite a lot. And the primary function was slave patrol, checking documents, enforcing slave codes, guarding against slave revolts, and catching runaway slaves. They were made up, as you would expect, mainly white males, but they went all the way from poor to plantation owner. So the whole spectrum, the whole class spectrum was involved in preserving the system of slavery. Later on, interestingly enough, the KKK and militias took over for a period during Reconstruction after the Civil War, and this morphed into formal police departments. So obviously, very relevant and very telling that the police departments kind of evolved out of these institutions. Sheriffs during the Reconstruction, they continued the slave patrol tradition as well. So very pointed origin of policing in the South, and it colors a lot of history after that. So in the 19th century specifically, this is the period when you look at different sources, you look at police history, one of the common themes is political control, that police were considered to be, and in substance really were, a political entity. And what was meant by that is that police were employed by politicians. They were actually employed by the politicians, to the point where a police regime or administration would come in, and then when a new mayor came in, for example, into a city, then everybody turned over, the entire police force, because it was just so highly political. And because of this, because it was political and they were beholden to their political patrons, there was a lot of political corruption, bribery and political vendettas carried out because they were an arm of the political candidates. And at that time, well, I don't know that things have changed necessarily, but at that time, politics was extremely, it was a contact sport. So it was extremely tough and rough. The police chiefs I mentioned, there was high turnover. If they resisted political influence, and there's cases marked by that, they were replaced immediately. And so that's why there was high turnover. Because if a police chief actually spoke up against some type of corruption or something they disagreed with, they were quickly replaced. There was no training at that time. Political loyalty was the real qualification, and that was the only qualification that was really looked at as a general trend. Very limited supervision because there was a lack of communication, advanced communication mechanisms. And so, if there was an officer assigned to a beat, well, how are you going to check in with them? There was, at least in the beginning, in the early 1800s, there was no radio. There was, if the officer was on another corner, you would just kind of call out or whistle the quote unquote supervisor, and then they'd whistle back, and then they could go back to taking their nap or going back to the bar or wherever it was. So that really had a different effect. But later on, call boxes, because obviously technology was developing quite rapidly in the 1800s, in the 19th century. So call boxes were added where the officers would then be able to check in directly with the police station. And so that did improve communications quite a bit. It was interesting because the officers were engaged primarily in social services rather than crime fighting in this period. And it was really more as an arm of the political candidate again. So to enhance the political patron's standing. Because you do services, how they talk about constituent services now. I mean, the police were really an arm performing these constituent services. So they might help to clean up, they might help to, handle different things around town and just make sure things were getting done, rather than a focus on crime fighting. Unfortunately, they were involved. The police themselves became more involved in some of the vices and things like that were going on because they were a corrupt institution, and again, if the politicians were corrupt, they were an extension of that. So there was a lot of that, a lot of vendettas against their opponents and things of that sort. The LEXOW Commission in 1894 was an attempt at reform. It was, a study, and you'll see a lot of studies and commissions throughout the history of policing in the United States. One of the first things they would do is say they would form a commission and study it. So this was in New York State. And four main conclusions that came out of that were that police were not the quote unquote guardians of the public. Instead, they were agents of Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall, again, being city, a term meant for City Hall, but like the corruption really in City Hall. And police enabled vice and took a cut. So we're talking about gambling, prostitution, things like that. Instead of policing these things, they were usually involved, and they actually took a percentage of it. They only look for stolen property if given a reward. This is what the commission found. Otherwise, there was no real effort made. And then, unfortunately, the commission found that the police harassed the less powerful. Again, we'll find that this theme, unfortunately, continues throughout the history. Initially, the officers that as a result of this commission, they were fired or they were convicted. But, and again, this is a theme that will come up in terms of accountability, later courts overturned this. So even though the commission did find quite a lot of violations and there were immediate apparent consequences, ultimately the courts overturned it. And again, this repeats itself. So the first half of the 20th century, we could get to the 20th century, and there were reforms. Again, there were attempts at reforms. I mean, that's really, if we want to look at it, these were attempts at reforms. The Wickersham Commission, we'll talk about that, commissioned by President Hoover. August VOLLMER, who is a giant when it comes to the history of police in America. His impact is still felt today, and so it's a figure that we really need to understand. And his proteges. The depoliticization of the police. We talked about the 19th century being the political era. So at least the effort to depoliticize, we can argue whether it was or not. Technology. The 1800s definitely saw rapid development of technology. Of course, as we know, in the 20th century, it only picked up further. So the adoption of technology, hiring standards, training, and then the purpose was officially shifted to actual crime fighting instead of social services. So these are themes that we see in the first half of the 20th century. The Wickersham Commission. So it's in 1929, and President Hoover appointed the commission to investigate ineffective of law enforcement. And as a result of that, there were a lot of things that came out of it, but what we would call the professionalization of police there was a trend towards the professionalization of police. And one thing to point out that's very important, actually, I didn't have a slide on, but that this is in the wake of prohibition. So there was a almost 10-year period of prohibition where the police were seen to be really ineffective and especially corrupt. And so there were a lot of abuses. And so the Wickersham Commission probably was brought to a head because of that, as the nation emerged from prohibition. Of course, where alcohol was outlawed. And professional police were started as a result of this, and I mean the trend in general, but the Wickersham Commission really recommended that. And then political precincts and political wards were changed to avoid overlap, which is interesting, because if the police did not overlap with a politician's ward directly, then it was harder to, or the incentives to exert complete political control were at least diminished, and they were diffused. So those were some key items from the Wickersham Commission. August Vollmer. Now, this is a very important figure. He was the Berkeley police chief, if you want to call it. I think town marshal really was the term, but from 1905. And he fought in the Philippine-American War, which is an important point, because he learned many techniques from there and tried to apply them in his philosophy and theory of policing. He was part of the Wickersham Commission, so he participated in the Wickersham Commission. Actually, in fact, he was probably one of the key figures there. So his ideas really had an impact. So he spread his ideas about the use of technology, professionalization, and police nationally, and partly through the Wickersham Commission and his post there. And then he effectively became like a consultant. When you look at his life, he went from police department to police department, state to state, and they would call him in. And this is actually a theme that we see even now, is that where there is a theory or there is somebody that comes up with a theory, through trainers, they are able to affect policy nationally by going to different departments and spreading their ideas. And if they're catchy ideas, they catch on. Well, by definition, catchy ideas catch on. So if they're catchy ideas, they're implemented quite easily or readily. The uniforms we talked about. He was very big into having uniforms, badges, and that mirrors the Peelian theory we talked about from the English, from Robert Peel. But in addition, interestingly, this is where he actually experimented with motorcycles first, and then eventually cars for his Berkeley police force. And of course, he spread that throughout. So when we say technology, I mean, really, we weren't, we were talking about basic technologies that seem basic to us now, but at that time were big advances. And so, yeah, again, cars and motorcycles allowed the police to catch up with potential criminals or anybody they were trying to catch up with quite fast, as obviously cars did as well, or they could take a bunch of them together. Radios allowed communication, instantaneous communication. You can call for backup, you can relay information, and then sledgehammers. It doesn't seem like a big technological upgrade, but allowed them to knock down doors and get into places where people didn't necessarily want them to, but they wanted to get into. He also pushed for military alpha psychology tests for recruits. So, and again, we can argue about the benefit of these things, but these were things that he did push and implemented, and they had an impact. So, obviously, this led to recruiting a certain profile of person, and to this day, I think we see the effects of that. And forensics, interestingly, this is where forensics really came into play. The use of labs, fingerprinting, lie detectors, all of this stuff had not been in play before this. And so Vollmer is the one who really pushed this, introduced it, would usually experiment in Berkeley and then push it out to the rest of the nation through his connections and influence. It's said, I mean, when I read about VOLLMER, and of course, just like so many figures that are important in these hot button issues, there's debate over them. But he's believed to have he believed in the genetic predisposition for crime. That's something that I think is agreed upon. Just believing that this is something that there is a predisposition for. If your parents or a parent was a criminal, then you were likely to be a criminal. He believed for genetic reasons, not necessarily socialization. And this, even if he didn't mean it to, it led to a racialization of crime, meaning that if there was a certain class of individuals or in the socioeconomic class that where there was a greater proportion of crime recorded, then that it was attributed as a genetic thing, and then that then carried through. Then of course you racialized it, because you would say, okay, well, Irish are more likely to commit crimes. African Americans are more likely to commit crimes, right? So really it led to racial profiling and these methods with this philosophy. And August VOLLMER definitely had a role to play in this. O.W. Wilson was his protege, was VOLLMER's protege, and he started the School of Criminology at the University of California. And just having a school of criminology was a big shift to have an entire school focused on criminology. And so they were trying to formalize this as on that same tack of professionalization and just trying to make it a science, a science of police, basically criminology. And his main contribution or effect on policing was in the area of police administration, on the structure. One of the key things, well, he had a manual that still was used for quite some time, police administration. It was titled Police Administration. So of course, if police trained on this, it had a major impact. So it's worth studying and looking at it more carefully. One of the key things is that it had a policy of distributing police based on reported crimes and calls for service. And again, this obviously probably made sense at the time, but if we look back and we look at the effects, if we start with a certain area that has a high number of reported crimes, and then we concentrate police there, it is likely that we will see more reported crimes because the police happen to be there. And so it becomes a self-perpetuating thing, and it's something that we'll discuss as we go along, because this does come into play later on. So we go to the 1950s and 60s. This is a time for social movements, race and increased tensions. I mean, these are key hot button items in the 1950s and 60s. This is, of course, when the civil rights movement was going on, and so it had an impact on police relations as well, and on the police themselves. This was an era where citizens were demanding non-criminal services of the police. If you recall, the police had shifted to crime prevention, and there was a demand for more quote unquote social services, things like that, and just non-criminal types of services. But unfortunately, at least the history seems to show that police responded with an emphasis on crime control, and rather than dealing with the social issues that were going on and helping in that area or dealing with them in a different way, they dealt with it from a crime control perspective. And this is important when it comes to the context of the civil rights movement. And we talked about this way in the beginning, but as I was mentioning that, justice is, as Thrasymachus talks about in the Plato's Republic, his opinion on what justice is it's enforcement of the laws of the powerful. And the laws at the time, as we now know, and there's consensus, were unjust when it came to minorities and African Americans in particular. So there was civil disobedience. There was a protest against those laws, rightfully so, movement against those laws. Rosa Parks, and then the Montgomery bus boycotts. That was in the 1950s, 1955. As a response to that, the police, they increased ticketing of black motorists, because blacks at that time were driving them instead of taking the bus. They were arranging to carpool and drive, and it was to the point where even Martin Luther King Jr., I believe, was ticketed for just driving 5 over, which this still plays out today. Many African Americans, if you talk to your African American friends and colleagues, they will tell you that they feel very nervous oftentimes exceeding the speed limit at all. And this may stem from this period of time on, because these practices have carried on. It's different for an African American to have a tail light out versus a white male. And honestly, for that matter, for in today's day and age, for an Asian American male. So there are key differences in how the police were enforcing, and so this crime control even was enforced in a disparate fashion, and as a reaction to these social movements. They made arrests at peaceful protests, and the Kerner Commission was commissioned at that time, and it showed that the police presence actually and police presence and action were actually a key factor in igniting disorder rather than keeping order, which was ostensibly what the purpose was supposed to be. Now, this was the era we had television and we had mass media, and so things were a little bit different. There were pictures of dogs being used on civil rights activists, and fire hoses with very famous pictures and videos, batons. These were televised and captured, and for the national mass media and for a national audience. And so it had a lot of impact. It was very bad, obviously, for PR, to say the least, for the police from their perspective, but it was also an eye-opener for the nation as to what was going on, and probably a catalyst for a lot of the change and perhaps the Civil Rights Act and some of the reforms that did happen. So again, a very important, I'd say turning point. I mean, it really laid out some lines for tensions that have really carried forward to today. One thing I wanted to touch about, in the 1970s, we'll get to the other periods, but police patrols in the 1970s, the Kansas City Patrol Project is probably the real the progenitor to the police patrol concept of running car patrols throughout cities routinely, just continuously, where police cars would drive and they would be at every corner all the time. If you mapped it out, there could be a police car there, coming periodically, almost all the time. And the thought was that, the same thing behind the philosophy of patrols was that if there's a police car there, then people are less likely to commit crimes. Instead, it failed, and it failed spectacularly, surprisingly. And what it was found, the problem that they identified was that it was too impersonal. That when the police were sitting in their cars, they did not actually engage with the community. They did not talk. They did not get tips. They were seen as disjointed or disconnected from the community, and this caused greater distrust. I mean, it also led to fear because there was no familiarity with the police sitting in their cars, and so it did not lead to the results that were desired. And there have been experiments and actually a move towards foot patrols, since then, in different areas, and those have been shown to create trust, familiarity, and connections. And so it was a result of this project. But unfortunately, patrols did continue in quite a lot of places, and still do, frankly. But that was an important issue that evolved. Now, in the 1980s, a key item, in the development of the police is the war on drugs. This had a major impact, and still continues to, its effects. It was all well and good to say that there was a war on drugs, but by and large, history has shown that it was enforced on Black and brown in America, and it was disproportionately enforced. The forces, the police, we talked about concentration of police. Police were concentrated in the areas where They expected there to be the most drug crimes, or perhaps the easiest to actually enforce. And so that ended up being in the inner city. And disproportionately, things like crack cocaine, which there was a whole crack cocaine epidemic, was in the inner city. And that was enforced disproportionate to cocaine, which was much more of a suburban thing. There's no denying that if police were to raid any affluent suburb of any major city in the United States in the 1980s, they would have been able to have a lot of cocaine busts. But that's not what usually happened. It was almost always in the inner cities. And so it led to greater tensions, greater incarceration. And again, disparate sentencing led to greater incarceration, and again, greater distrust. Arguably led to a lot of breakdown of families, because many males, especially black males, were sent to jail and prison because of violations of drug violations, or related to drug violations, because of disparate sentencing and disproportional sentencing. We'll talk about that in a little bit. For example, crack had multi-year sentences versus cocaine was oftentimes less than a year, or if even any jail time, and oftentimes it wasn't. It was considered a quote-unquote recreational drug almost, even though on the books it may have had some penalties. The way it was enforced, it was very different. And even on the books, crack versus cocaine had very disparate sentencing guidelines. So it's important to keep in mind. And Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, talks about this at length, and is definitely a book worth looking at when it comes to this. So the 1990s, very active time, and I apologize for the small slide on this. Meaning there was too much information. I should have split this up, but here we have it. The 1990s, it's marked by the crime bill, the mass incarceration, and unfortunately brutality, or highlighting brutality. So one of the key things, and the interesting thing is, up to now, the crime rates had actually been increasing. They'd been increasing for quite some time. New York City in the 70s and 80s, Manhattan was not a very safe place. It was a very high crime rate. You were likely, this is where New York got its reputation at the time. You're likely to have your car stolen, your windows broken, whatever it may be. There was a lot of violent crime at the time. So crime rates had been rising sharply, and it was a national issue. It was something that was of great interest to people. But it's interesting, if in the 1990s as a whole, crime rate fell across the board. And that's important to note, because a lot of people claim to know the reason for it, or claim credit for it as well. And so it's important to note that it is a fact that across the board, crime fell. So it's hard to say which measures actually led to this. Also, prosperity increased overall too. Unemployment reduced as well. So those are factors to look at. Now, this is the time in 1990, Rodney King. And I won't assume that everybody knows some of these things, because of course we have people of different ages that are probably viewing this. And Rodney King was, an African-American man who was beaten severely by a slew of LA police officers. Was multiple officers beating him with batons, severely beating him. Now, the difference was that it was actually recorded. Now, there were no iPhones at that time, but somebody had a portable video camera, a camcorder, and they recorded it. And so again, it was broadcast on the news. It was broadcast all over. There was no YouTube in the early 90s. This is the era, I have to say that, for those who were not of age at that time. But you had national news, and it made national news. And so this really forced the issue of police brutality and excessive force. It brought it up again, and there was a commission, the Christopher Commission, that took a look at excessive force and the police. It found that there was excessive force that was rampant. They found it to be a management issue. and they called for accountability for the managers, and they they stated that the repeat offenders in the LA Police Department were a problem, that there were some officers, I think it was probably 200 or to 300 officers that were the cause of most of the offenses and the problem, but that they kept on offending, but they weren't reprimanded, and they kept on coming back into the force and put out on the street. And then they also concluded that the complaint system, if there were complaints within the department of other officers or in general, it was skewed against them, against the people who made the complaint. So this was it identified these as problems. Now, the other big thing that came out in the 1990s was the crime bill. It's known as the crime bill. There's a longer name for it. You can look it up, but if you look up crime bill, this is what will come up in 1994. And this was under the Clinton administration, Clinton and Biden. And the reason that's relevant right now is, of course, it's been brought up now because of Joe Biden's involvement in this crime bill and what is attributed to this crime bill and the effects of the crime bill. But there was a call for, again, because of the increasing level of crime, there was a call for some type of action. And the Democrats were seen as being soft on crime. Dukakis had they had lost because of crime, they felt. So they were Bill Clinton and Joe Biden were very wary of not being seen as tough on crime. And so this crime bill is seen as that response to that. Now, it provided funding for 100,000 new officers. Now, remember, though, this is federal funding, so there were certain things tied to it, and that's important to note. There was $6 billion in what were called prevention programs, but the argument is that they were actually incentives for drug busts, because that's what they were called, prevention programs. But you got rewarded if you wanted to keep on getting the grant by showing how many drug convictions or arrests that were made by your department. So that there were incentives that were created, and it's important to note. $9 billion went to prisons. This was it's very controversial now in retrospect, because it's argued that there were incentives created for states to actually build prisons, and not only to build them, but to keep them filled, because again, funding was dependent on how you performed in terms of building these prisons and keeping them, or the need for them. There was, other things that are seen probably as good were a ban on assault weapons, the Violence Against Women Act, which took several measures that protected women against domestic violence and against other acts of violence. Background checks needed for guns and things of that sort. So that was part of it as well, and that's actually why some Congress members said that they voted for this, including Bernie Sanders. But it arguably led to mass incarceration, and that's important, right? There were tougher federal sentencing guidelines, and these federal sentencing guidelines carried down to, they had an effect arguably on states, because oftentimes states will emulate what the federal government has. 3 strikes provision. You have 3. It's too simple to say just 3 strikes, like 3 violations, but a felony plus 2 other violations gave you a life sentence. And this was adopted by many states as well. But the federal guidelines, were the 3 strikes. So that was seen as too harsh. Truth in sentencing, again at the federal level, but influenced state level, arguably, was that oftentimes you might get a 10-year sentence, but you would then get out in 3 years for good behavior. But this called for prisoners to serve out 85% of their sentencing. So again, very harsh in many cases. So it's important to note the broken windows theory was an important development in policing, and it was developed in 1982, but adopted in a form by New York City in the 1990s under Rudy Giuliani and his police commissioner, Bratton. Under this, they had to stop and frisk. And the broken windows theory was simply to say that, if you take care of some of the small things, The theory is called broken windows because if you fix the broken windows of an area, then it sends a signal that this is not a place for committing crimes or these things. So in practice in New York City, that meant prosecuting subway jumpers, where they would just jump over and not pay the subway toll. Stopping and frisking and just getting somebody, if just randomly stop them, frisk them, and if they have a baggie, okay, book them, right? And so that really caused a lot of tension. It led to profiling. It led to a lot of negative encounters with the police. And then the 1990s was also marked by Amadou Diallo. The Amadou Diallo case, he was Muslim actually. I think he was Ghanaian. He was Muslim, and he was wrongfully killed by the police in an early morning knock. And he opened the door. He was reaching for his wallet to show them his ID ostensibly, and he was shot 43 times and died. So again, this was a national story and really brought into question again policing and how policing was being conducted. Overly aggressive. New York City, being the focus, and then brought into focus all these issues, the broken windows theory and Giuliani's tough on crime. I'm going to speed up a little bit because I want to leave some time for questions if there are any. As I said, there's so much to cover. The 2000s, this is the era of iPhone and social media, and that's important, but because perhaps these incidents were already occurring and likely were, but we see them more often or have seen them more often because they're easily recorded and disseminated. But this was the era of Columbine. Again, the mass shooting, school shootings. School shootings were not a thing before Columbine. Columbine being the main, first big school shooting that was actually, again, not televised actual shooting, but the surrounding circumstances and what was happening as it was going on. And it was horrifying to the nation, but it led to police in schools. That was the response, by and large, for a lot of districts and things like that. So a lot of police in schools, and so that created a different role again, and lots of issues with that as well, because police then started using police tactics and treating students as criminals, and using some of the same profiling that they did in other areas. This caused a lot of problems. The Rampart scandal in LA. The LA Police Department had a massive scandal called the Rampart scandal. The Rampart was a special unit, and special units, and the reason we talk about this also because special units become an issue as well in the history of police in America, because they were largely just like military units, like the Navy SEALs or whatever. They were seen as their elite units, but they didn't get as much supervision, and then that led to a lot of corruption, and this implicated at least 75, if not more, police officers in the LA Police Department who were, thought to have or shown to have engaged in a lot of criminal activity, almost like a gang. Too many cases to, if you go to say their name, if you just put that in Google, you'll get all these cases, unfortunately, that happened in the 2000s. Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, George Floyd, of course, everybody knows that now, Breonna Taylor. So these cases just highlighted the tension and the police brutality, really, when it comes to minorities and in particular African Americans. And then, of course, we are in the era of where people are talking about defund the police, which really maybe poorly named. Maybe that's controversial to say that, but I'm just expressing my opinion. Maybe poorly named because it doesn't really truly usually mean defunding the police. It usually means reallocating funds to, if we look at the historical trend where police had some social services that they were engaging in and other things, is to take funds and put them towards things like mental health and social work and counseling, other things, community engagement, rather than the military public safety function. And retooling the police is really what is meant. But that's the era that we're in. Let's look at some factors preventing reform in the time that we have left. If we look at it, and there's a lot of things, but one of the things is qualified immunity is a topic that's been debated quite a lot. And the police have something called and other governmental officials do too, but we're talking about the police here, something called qualified immunity. So if a police officer shoots somebody in the line of duty, they are looked at, there's a standard called qualified immunity, that they have immunity. It's qualified because there could be an exception to it, but it's a very high bar that somebody has to overcome to show that they have violated, that the person who was killed, for example, had their constitutional rights violated. There's some specific constitutional rights, if they're violated, under Section 1983 of the Civil Rights Act, that you can sue a governmental entity, and a police officer themselves has qualified immunity. And so that's proven to be a big barrier. It's been very hard for people to actually sue police officers effectively, and or police departments for that matter. And so that is a barrier to accountability. Police fraternity and unions. So fraternity meaning in the just general term that police stick together. Historically, they've stuck together, and they have covered for their own. There's a case in Buffalo, recently with the different protests that were going on, and where the elderly gentleman, the protester, was pushed down and hit his head and was severely injured. And so that officer was suspended. When he was suspended, 57 other officers in that unit, it was supposed to be a special unit, resigned. So that shows you, instead of perhaps looking with an eye of discernment as to whether there's some bad apples, unfortunately, the trend seems to be in many cases where the police cover for each other, whether or not they themselves are engaged in bad behavior. Unions, unfortunately, in many cases have perpetuated this. So discipline of officers that have offended has been very hard because of police unions. So there's a lot of talk about police union reform because of this, but it's very hard because of that. Of course, undeniable that unions have also gotten rights for various classes, labor classes, but this has been an impediment in this area, arguably. Lack of accountability in general, so that goes to even the first two items. But if there's no repercussions, then unfortunately behavior usually continues, and so this is definitely a factor in preventing reform. And then polarization. Unfortunately, these issues, just like so many issues nowadays, are talked about in extreme terms. So even the problem, perhaps, with the term of defund the police is that it doesn't get enough people on board, because even though most people, they don't mean defund the police, in reality, the term is taken at face value by many, and it may cause them not to support the more nuanced reforms that are needed. And then crime itself is a political hot button issue. As we saw with the crime bill, the Democrats didn't want to be seen as soft on crime, just like the Democrats under President Obama did not want to be seen as soft on terror. So we saw a lot of drone bombings and a lot of other things there in order to perhaps address that. So the same way, when it comes to crime, it's a political hot button. So when you go for reform or you try to do anything with the police, you're seen or you're accused of being soft on crime, and so then it becomes hard for reform. So key issues, in wrapping up, and again, there was so much that we could go into further, but we don't have time in this limited time we have. Key issues that you see coming up in this history is trust and community connections. This plays into it. If there's trust in the police, there's likely that they're more effective, and community connections allows for a more nuanced approach. Targeting and profiling. It's a major issue. Of course, we see it from August VOLLMER's time, and probably before that, actually, frankly. It comes before that, but really formalized. And profiling has been shown to lead to a greater likelihood of an African-American male, for example, being shot because they fit a profile, or being arrested, or being stopped even. Black, brown, in different contexts. For Muslims, we can see that in perhaps at the airport with the TSA. We've perhaps felt that as a broader community. But this is applicable for African Americans in everyday, driving, the driving while black, terminology. It's become even more enhanced now. Well, this goes into flawed use of technology. So technology has only advanced since the days of August VOLLMER and his implementation of technology. Technology has been used even more and more. And we didn't get to talk about the policies that actually eased, and that was under the Obama administration even, but and it continued. But the easing of access to military technology by the police force. There's a concept of posse comitatus act, which prohibits the military from acting as a police force. But the police forces were, when they were given cheap access to military equipment, and we're talking about armored vehicles and very heavy duty weapons and guns. They jumped at it, and they continue to jump at it, and so this really caused a militarization of the police. But in addition, technology, if we talk about it, is the use. We didn't talk about surveillance, and this is CAIR Michigan, for example, had expressed some hesitation on the Operation Greenlight in the city of Detroit. Whereas there's benefits, of course, and technology can be shown in many cases to fight crime, but there's also a lot of downsides when it comes to using cameras and surveillance and automated artificial intelligence. So it's using algorithms, and there's been many incidents where algorithms have been used for facial recognition technology, and they have incorrectly identified faces, especially and particularly of minorities, as criminals when they did not really match up, but the algorithm showed they did. And speaking of algorithms are built on previous data. And so if the data is skewed, for example, if we use 1980s data and it shows that the likelihood of criminal activity in the city of Detroit is greater than the likelihood of criminal activity in Bluefield Hills. Well, as we talked about, that's probably, some of it would be because if we, for example, crack violations would have been a lot more than any cocaine violations. That's just part of it. It's not to say that that's the entire story, but that we have to be mindful of this when it comes to algorithms and their use as well. Excessive and unjustified force, of course, we've seen that throughout, and the forms of force being used, the chokeholds. We know that, unfortunately, that was a trend we didn't talk about, but the Israeli military has come in and trained several departments in the United States, and they've been using a lot of those methods, which are overly aggressive and have led to unfortunate, in some cases, deaths, including George Floyd and Eric Garner, perhaps. Crime prevention, detection, or social services, we talked about that. Mixing of public safety with social services, we talked about that. And then training and qualifications. There's been talk about requiring a bachelor's degree or higher training and qualifications of these of our officers, perhaps leading to higher quality of candidates and officers. And then accountability, we talked about that in the previous slide, and some methods perhaps for increasing accountability. If there's accountability, perhaps there will be mitigation of some of these incidents. And then we talk about incentives. A quick thing on that, data for learning versus data for inspection. You see I talk about that, but there was a big push on data in the 90s and into the 2000s. And unfortunately, there were incentives tied to grants. And so you had to show that you had a certain number of drug busts, or you had a certain number of this type of, stop. You had a certain number of stops, period. And so that just leads to bad incentives sometimes. And it doesn't necessarily, and then if it's used for inspection, meaning that you're measured by this and your funding is dependent on this, your salary is dependent on this, then of course you're going to behave differently. So it became, actually, in New York City, if your numbers were low on rape, for example, then you got, you had certain funding coming, or you met your goals. So what would happen, it was found that a lot of police departments were telling their officers not to report something as rape, even though it was rape. They would say, well, they would say, okay, well, I'm going to write you up for, petty crime, whatever it may be, some totally unrelated thing, because they wanted to record it. They did not want to record it as a rape. So we have to be careful about this when we're looking at this. So again, a very complex issue, very broad issue. I hopefully gave you some overview of this topic. It's again, if we have time for questions, I guess Zainab, we can take questions now. Otherwise, we can wrap up.
Thank you so much, Brother Haaris. That was an extremely informative discussion. I certainly learned a lot. We don't have any comments or questions right now, but sort of just in reflection, listening to you go through the history of policing in America really just, reminded me of, the beginning of policing and how that was really an extension of maintaining control over slaves, and how that continuously changed century after century, and even as you were going into detail, decade after decade, what we've seen, and the negative effects of policing on, more specifically, Black Americans, and how we see that today, and especially in 2020, many people were shocked and surprised by sort of this idea of police brutality when these events came up. But as you showed us, unfortunately, policing in America has a long history of these things and of negative effects, and in a way, just as Brother Dawood says, he's mentioned this before in many of these sessions, the system is not broken, it's working just as it was designed to work. And that's what we're seeing, the effects on Black Americans, minorities, and what that looks like. So thank you. I think this is an extremely important topic, especially because we're trying to highlight these things within this class series, issues and discussions and topics that aren't talked about even in schools, but they do have a great effect on us today. So thank you, Brother Haaris, for presenting. And I want everybody to keep in mind that next week's session, we'll be having another class led by Brother Dawood, Executive Director of CAIR Michigan, and it is titled The Social Construction of Whiteness, which I think will be a great class after this one to really talk about the political ideology of whiteness and Blackness, especially in America, and how those two things are used as political tools. Who was white during certain periods of time for what benefit or for what use. So thank you to all who attended. Thank you again, Brother Haaris, for putting in the time and effort today and for presenting and helping us understand more of the history. And inshallah, we will see you all next week. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.